The HOA had never met anyone like me. When they showed up, clipboards in hand and smug smiles plastered on their faces, I thought, great, another battle with bureaucracy. They wanted me off the farm lake. Me, owner of the lake, the land surrounding it, and, ironically, the very parking lot they relied on. As they barked rules and threats, I leaned against my dock, sipping sweet tea, smiling inwardly at the delicious irony. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was poetic justice. The power dynamics had shifted before they even realized it. I had the leverage. And if they thought they could bully me, they were about to learn a lesson in humility, patience, and, most importantly, how quickly karma could turn a parking lot into a battlefield. The morning sunlight spilled lazily over the farm lake, glinting off the water like a million tiny mirrors, and I was leaning back on my dock with my toes dipped into the cool surface, savoring the kind of peace that most people only dream about. The birds were arguing in the treetops, a symphony of chirps and squawks that somehow made the world feel alive yet entirely mine. For once, I thought, I had a day without drama. But I should have known better. From the corner of my eye, I noticed the faint rumble of a car approaching, nothing unusual, except for the synchronized air of menace that seemed to ooze from the black SUVs creeping up the long dirt driveway that led to my property. The kind of menace that comes with clipboards, power suits, and a misguided sense of self-importance. And, of course, the HOA. They stepped out like soldiers preparing for battle, although their armor consisted of sensible shoes, khaki pants, and tightly pressed button-up shirts. Their eyes were hidden behind a uniform of sunglasses, which only made them look more ridiculous to me than intimidating. I, on the other hand, had the luxury of being utterly at ease, lounging in a loose cotton shirt, worn jeans, and flip-flops that had seen better days. I waved lazily, a gesture that was both welcoming and passive-aggressive in its own right. I could almost hear their collective internal groan. This would be one of those days. The leader of the group, a woman named Marcy who somehow managed to project both boredom and authority simultaneously, strutted toward me with a clipboard in hand. I could tell she had been rehearsing this walk, practicing the perfect amount of, I am in control, posture for the exact moment she would confront me. She stopped 3 feet from the dock, tapping her pen against the clipboard with a rhythm that was probably meant to unsettle me. "Good morning," she said, the words clipped and stiff, like a poorly executed bow. "We're here on behalf of the Homeowners Association. We need to discuss your activities at the lake." I raised an eyebrow, letting my smile linger just long enough to make her uncomfortable. "Activities at the lake? You mean swimming, fishing, enjoying life, and being a good neighbor?" I asked, voice light, almost playful, but underneath, I could feel the simmering tension that always preceded these encounters. Marcy didn't return my smile, which was exactly what I had expected. She sniffed, a small, self-important gesture that screamed, "I have authority here," and I fought the urge to laugh. "Your presence here is a concern," she said finally, as if that explained everything. She glanced at the others, a mix of men and women in their late 40s to early 60s, all nodding gravely as though I had just confessed to starting a small fire on the property. Their collective seriousness only made me grin wider. It was absurd. I owned the lake. I owned the land surrounding it. Hell, I even owned the parking lot they drove through to get here. They had come armed with threats and rules, but in reality, they were standing on my turf, and they had no idea it. I took a sip of the iced tea I had brought with me, letting the liquid slide down my throat slowly, deliberately. "So," I said, tilting my head, "are you here to discuss anything specific, or are we just going to stand around with clipboards like a nature documentary about overly bureaucratic humans?" The words were casual, but my eyes were sharp, studying each face carefully. I could see the flicker of annoyance cross Marcy's face, the tightening of her jaw, and the subtle shift in stance that betrayed her discomfort. My little observation felt delicious. Marcy cleared her throat and began to read from her clipboard, her voice taking on the sing-song quality of someone trying to sound official without sounding patronizing. "It has come to the attention of the HOA that your usage of the lake property may be in violation of several community guidelines, including, but not limited to, unauthorized use of watercraft, noise disturbances, and," she paused, glancing down at the paper like the words were written in some ancient, sacred language, "improper maintenance of your lakeside property." I nearly choked on my tea. Improper maintenance. My property looked like something out of a glossy magazine spread, not that it mattered. "Improper maintenance?" I asked, tilting my head. "I can assure you, the ducks, the fish, and the occasional frog would wholeheartedly disagree." My tone was teasing, but the edge was there, sharp enough to remind them that I was not someone to be trifled with. One of the men, a short, balding fellow with a permanent frown, stepped forward, his voice quivering slightly as he tried to assert some semblance of authority. Well, technically, according to Section 14, Paragraph 7, Subsection B, residents are required to adhere to certain environmental and aesthetic regulations, he trailed off, because, apparently, even reading legalese out loud did not imbue him with confidence. I smiled sympathetically at him. Poor guy, he had no idea he was standing on the land that legally belonged to me. I leaned back, letting my hand graze the wooden edge of the dock, letting the sunlight warm my skin, enjoying the sound of the water lapping against the posts. You're saying I'm breaking rules, I said slowly, savoring each word, but you're standing on property that I own, telling me what I can and cannot do. Isn't that fascinating? The words hung in the air, heavy with irony. Marcy's lips pressed into a thin line, and I could see her mind working furiously, probably trying to figure out if there was some loophole in the universe that would allow her to bully a landowner into submission. Spoiler alert, there isn't. I think we need to discuss this further with the board, she stammered, flipping her clipboard like a lifeline. There are protocols, and meetings, and, she stopped herself, realizing that none of this was particularly intimidating to someone who had already paid for the land, the lake, and the parking lot. I could practically see the gears grinding in her head as she tried to figure out how to assert dominance in a situation where she had none. I tapped my fingers lightly on the dock, enjoying the suspense. Of course, I said sweetly, we can absolutely schedule a meeting. Maybe after you've had a chance to read your own property deeds and realize how charming it is when irony walks into a room wearing sensible shoes. I let the words hang there, dripping with subtle amusement. The HOA members exchanged glances, a silent communication that translated perfectly to me. We didn't anticipate this. Exactly. Then, just to make things a little more interesting, I added, by the way, do you need to park your vehicles? I'd hate for anyone to inconvenience themselves. The pause that followed was priceless. Slowly, the reality began to dawn on them, they couldn't just park wherever they wanted. The lot was mine, and if I wanted to, I could make their day extraordinarily difficult with nothing more than a well-placed, no trespassing, sign and a few strategically locked gates. Marcy's face tightened, her fingers gripping the clipboard like it was a lifebuoy. The ducks decided that was the perfect moment to quack indignantly, as if supporting my stance, while a dragonfly skimmed the surface of the water, completely indifferent to human drama. I watched them both, amused at the cosmic timing. You see, I continued, savoring the moment, the lake has been very generous to me over the years. It provides water, fish, and tranquility. But it's also quite literal when it comes to boundaries. Step carefully. My tone was playful, but every word carried weight. Marcy attempted to regain control, clearing her throat again and raising a finger as if she were about to deliver the final blow. Regardless of ownership, she said, her voice firm but shaky, residents are expected to comply with HOA regulations. Failure to do so, she paused dramatically, looking at me as though she expected me to break into a panic, may result in penalties, fines, or legal action. I laughed, a soft, incredulous sound, not mocking, but filled with disbelief at the sheer audacity. Penalties, fines, you do realize, I said, tilting my head, that without access to the parking lot, enforcing those fines might be tricky. Hypothetical even. I let the words settle like stones in a still pond. Their expressions shifted, nervous, frustrated, slightly panicked, but I maintained my calm, enjoying the delicious imbalance of power. The sun climbed higher, illuminating every wrinkle, every bead of sweat, every futile attempt at authority. I rose slowly from the dock, brushing my hands together, letting the movement feel natural, unthreatening, but deliberate. I stepped closer, leaning against the railing with the ease of someone who knew the outcome before the first word was spoken. Look, I like harmony. I like rules, but I also like facts. And the fact is, this lake, this dock, and that little parking lot you rely on. All mine. Consider this a friendly reminder before we embark on what could be a very long conversation. Marcy opened her mouth, but no words came out immediately. Her team shuffled awkwardly, glancing at one another like startled children. Even the balding man seemed to shrink slightly, realizing for the first time that the world was not aligned in his favor today. The ducks continued their quacking chorus, the sun sparkled on the water, and I leaned back again, savoring the moment. Yes, I thought, as I watched them gather their papers and mutter among themselves. This was going to be an interesting day. Very, very interesting. And if they thought they were going to intimidate me, they were in for a lesson in patience, poise, and the art of turning a parking lot into a battlefield. The next morning, I woke to the gentle lapping of water against the shore, birds still squabbling in the trees, and the sun casting gold across the lake's surface. Normally, this was the kind of peaceful scene that made a person forget about paperwork, taxes, and WA nonsense. Normally. Today, however, the serenity was a lie. Even before my coffee had cooled, my phone buzzed incessantly with texts, emails, and notifications from neighbors who apparently had nothing better to do than relay every movement of the HOA. Marcy, it seemed, was not one to let a day pass without asserting the imagined authority she carried like a badge, even though, technically, it wasn't hers to wield. I grinned and sipped my coffee, letting the irony roll over me like the morning mist over the lake. By mid-morning, the WA team had returned, this time armed with pamphlets, printed rules, and a confidence that was almost admirable if it weren't so entirely misplaced. They parked in what I generously allowed as their official lot, and immediately began flapping clipboards like oversized wings, each one more serious than the next. I watched from my porch as Marcy marched toward me, her posture rigid, her eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, giving her the expression of someone who believed she could command the weather itself. I waved lazily. "Good morning, Marcy. I trust you slept well after our little chat yesterday." Her lips pressed into that tight line she favored, the one that said, "I will not be amused." "Perfect. Good morning," she said sharply, ignoring the sarcasm that dripped from my tone like honey from a comb. "We're here to ensure compliance with the WA regulations. You've been cited for violations of several clauses, including watercraft usage, landscaping aesthetics, and," she squinted at her papers, as though reading a menu she didn't like, "noise disturbances." I chuckled softly, the sound drifting over the lake. "Noise disturbances?" I asked, arching an eyebrow. "From whom?" "The ducks. The wind through the trees. My singing. Because, last I checked, the only sound I've made that wasn't natural was the gentle scraping of a rake across my dock, and I assure you, it's very soothing." I paused, letting the humor hang in the air. Marcy's jaw twitched, a tiny betrayal of the frustration bubbling beneath her calm exterior. Her assistant, a young man who still seemed to think that reading the rulebook aloud was a legitimate form of intimidation, piped up. "According to Section 14, Paragraph 7, Subsection B," he trailed off mid-sentence, clearly aware that I wasn't taking him seriously. I smiled at him sympathetically. "Ah, yes, Subsection B, always a classic. Don't worry, I read it myself last night. Fascinating stuff. Very dry." My voice was playful, but my eyes were sharp, gauging their reactions, noting every twitch, every barely concealed sigh. Marcy cleared her throat, attempting to regain some sense of authority. "Regardless of your enjoyment of nature, all residents are expected to comply with WA regulations. Noncompliance can result in fines or legal action." She said the words slowly, as if enunciating them carefully would somehow make them true in the face of reality. I leaned against the railing, smiling as though we were discussing something trivial, like the weather. "Fines, legal action," I repeated, savoring the delicious irony. "You do realize that enforcing fines is a bit complicated when you're standing on someone else's property. Particularly when that someone else owns the lake, the surrounding land, and, yes, the parking lot you drove through to get here." The words were deliberate, a measured punch to the balloon of authority Marcy had tried to inflate. She blinked, visibly startled by the casual confidence I radiated. Marcy's assistant shifted uneasily, adjusting his tie in a futile attempt at composure. "Well, technically," he began, and I stopped him midair with a raised hand. "Technically, my friend, is a word I like. It usually precedes a lengthy explanation of why someone's authority is irrelevant." He flushed slightly, while Marcy's frown deepened, the corners of her mouth pressing down like someone had just dunked her face in cold water. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the tension simmer. "Here's the thing," I said, lowering the mug and placing it deliberately on the railing, "I have no problem with rules. I actually enjoy rules. Rules can be neat, orderly, and very predictable. But rules only work when the people enforcing them actually have the right to do so. You see, Marcy, yesterday was a lesson in irony. Today is a lesson in practicality. And tomorrow," I let the pause stretch just long enough for imagination to work its magic, "well, tomorrow is when things get interesting." The HOA team exchanged nervous glances, the kind that silently asked, did she just threaten us with humor? I smiled inwardly. Yes, yes I did. It was delicious. And even better, I had already started planning my subtle first moves. The first order of business, I decided, was to test the waters, literally. I strolled down to the dock, where my small, lovingly maintained rowboat bobbed lazily in the current. I untied it, letting it drift a few feet away, then pushed it gently toward the small pier where the HOA had decided to station themselves. You'll notice, I said brightly, that all watercraft must be registered, inspected, and operated safely, according to your lovely rules. I hope that includes boats used solely for observation purposes. I grinned, and for a brief second, I thought I saw Marcy's eyebrows knit in confusion. Then came the parking test. I walked over to the lot, noting the small SUV parked a little too close to the edge. With nothing more than a gentle flick of the gate lock, I let it slide closed just enough to make it awkward to maneuver. A low murmur went through the HOA team. Now, don't worry, I said cheerfully, I wouldn't dream of actually blocking you. But, hypothetically, if one were to park without permission, and one owned the land, it might, just might, pose a tiny inconvenience. The subtlety of my threat was exquisite, and the discomfort was immediate. Marcy's lips pressed into a thin line, her hands clutching the clipboard like a lifeline. We need to speak with the board, she said, her voice shaky, betraying her attempts at calm authority. I tilted my head, smiling. By all means, take your time, the lake will still be here when you return. The ducks, the wind, the sun, eternal. Unlike authority based on paper and intimidation, which, as you may be discovering, is rather fragile. Her assistant whispered something to her, and I could see the gears turning. They were plotting, I was sure, some brilliant maneuver to regain control. Perhaps a letter, a warning, a threat, maybe even a meeting at the community center where they could pretend power existed. I leaned back against the railing, watching them scurry like ants over a sugar cube, amused and entirely unbothered. Finally, Marcy straightened, attempting a final show of defiance. We expect cooperation. This is your final warning. She emphasized each word, as though the force of her vocal delivery could alter reality. I chuckled softly. Final warning, how dramatic. You do realize, I said, gesturing toward the lake and then to the parking lot, that warnings are a bit hypothetical when you're on someone else's land. Particularly when said land provides all the resources you depend on for your operations. My tone was gentle, almost conversational, but it carried the weight of inevitability. By mid-afternoon, they finally departed, dragging their clipboards, their pride, and their misplaced confidence behind them like a caravan of defeated soldiers. I watched them go, shaking my head with amusement. The lake was calm again, my dock untouched, the water sparkling in the sunlight. And yet, I knew this was only the beginning. The HOA thought they could intimidate, control, and impose their ridiculous rules on me. They hadn't realized that irony, patience, and a strategically owned parking lot were all part of my arsenal. Sitting back on the dock, I sipped my now slightly warm coffee and let the quiet return. The ducks quacked as if congratulating me, the breeze whispered through the trees, and the sun continued its slow climb. Tomorrow would bring more rules, more threats, more absurdity. And I would be ready. Because while the HOA thought they had authority, I knew the truth. Power wasn't about clipboards, legalese, or posturing, it was about leverage. And I had plenty of that. Yes, tomorrow would indeed be very interesting. The sun rose lazily over the farm lake, painting the water in molten gold, and I sat on my porch, coffee in hand, letting the warmth of the morning seep into my bones. Yesterday's visit from the HOA still hung in the air like a stubborn fog, a mix of irritation, amusement, and anticipation buzzing inside me. I could almost hear their clipped voices. The shuffle of papers, the exasperated mutters as they realized they weren't as in control as they'd assumed. But as I sipped, a thought crossed my mind, sharp as a fishhook, the moment of leverage had arrived. It wasn't just a strategy, it was poetry in motion. I had always known the lake was mine. The deed had my name in bold, official ink, and the surrounding land had been purchased decades ago by my family. It was more than property, it was a sanctuary, a fortress, and a playground all rolled into one. In the parking lot, oh, the parking lot, that unassuming strip of gravel at the entrance of the property, the one the HOA relied on daily to move in and out, deliver supplies, and host their little bureaucratic gatherings. They had assumed power because of their self-importance and collective delusion. But in reality, I held all the cards, and the first thrill of that realization sent a shiver down my spine. I stood and stretched, letting my gaze sweep over the lake. The ducks were busy with their morning routines, oblivious to human drama, and a family of geese glided past, regal and serene. To an outsider, it would appear peaceful, idyllic even. But to me, it was a stage set perfectly for a little theater of consequences. The moment the HOA thought they could intimidate me, I had begun plotting the subtle, patient maneuvers that would turn every rule, every threat, into a reflection of their own folly. The lake and the parking lot were my allies. They didn't know it yet, but I was about to show them. I wandered down to the dock, letting my fingers trail through the cool water as I thought. Every move they made yesterday had given me information: their personalities, their weaknesses, their reliance on the infrastructure I provided. Marcy, of course, was the ringleader, smug, rigid, full of theatrics, but prone to panic when reality contradicted her narrative. Her assistant, the poor kid, was obedient and nervous, the kind who repeated rules without ever thinking. The balding man, easily flustered, desperate to justify authority, but without a spine. And the rest, a mix of anxious yes men and women, each trying to assert dominance in a world where they had none. My lips curved into a smile. The cast was perfect. Then I turned my attention to the lot. The gravel crunched underfoot as I walked along its edge, and I inspected the gate. Locked, solid, impenetrable to anyone without my key. The cars parked inside yesterday, a symbol of their daily convenience, had reminded me just how much control I could wield with minimal effort. I could restrict access, block their vehicles, reroute their paths, all without raising a hand. It was a game of subtle power, the kind that didn't scream but whispered. And the best part, they didn't even realize I was playing. I spent the next hour pacing, planning. Every hypothetical move they could make, every attempt to assert authority, could be countered not with anger but with strategy. It was almost like chess, except the board was the lake, the dock, and the parking lot, and the pieces were people who thought rules trumped reality. I began listing ideas mentally: block the parking lot subtly, limit their access to the dock, make their meetings slightly inconvenient without overt confrontation. Each move would be a lesson wrapped in humor, irony, and humility. Then it hit me: their obsession with rules was a weakness. They depended on their own documentation, their printed regulations, their rigid sense of order. I could exploit that. I could allow them the illusion of authority while nudging reality in directions they couldn't anticipate. Yesterday had been playful. Today, I realized, I was in control. The satisfaction of that revelation made me grin, and I couldn't help but chuckle aloud. "Oh, this is going to be fun," I muttered to myself, as if the lake itself were in on the joke. I decided to test the waters, again. Not with confrontation, but with subtle assertion. I retrieved a small rowboat, tucking it into a corner of the dock where they had attempted to inspect yesterday. A small sign, hand-painted and charmingly polite, now leaned against the dock: "Private dock, used by permission only." It wasn't aggressive, it was a reminder. And yet, the implication was clear. They relied on this dock, but I controlled access. That tiny action, I knew, would gnaw at their nerves in ways words never could. Next, I inspected the lot again. A few rocks, strategically placed near the entrance, could make maneuvering slightly awkward. Nothing dramatic, nothing aggressive, just enough to introduce mild inconvenience. Sometimes, the best power plays were invisible, the kind that left the opponent questioning themselves. I imagined Marcy's expression as she returned and discovered the subtle shifts: a barricade where none had existed, a gate slightly more daunting. It would teach patience, humility, and, most importantly, the realization that I was not someone to underestimate. By mid-morning, I was fully engrossed in planning, pacing along the dock, letting ideas flow like the gentle current beneath my feet. I considered timing, psychology, and the dramatic irony that made every action both strategic and amusing. The ducks quacked in approval, or so I imagined, and a dragonfly skimmed the surface, blissfully unaware of human absurdity. The sun climbed higher, casting gold over the lake, and I felt the thrill of anticipation. Power, I realized, was not about anger or confrontation. It was about leverage, patience, and knowing when to smile while the other side floundered. Around noon, I decided to take action on a different front: communication. I drafted a polite but pointed email to the HOA board, outlining a few clarifications regarding property lines, deed ownership, and access rights. I wrote it in the kind of tone that seemed cooperative on the surface but left them squirming underneath. It was amazing how much could be conveyed in a single, well-worded paragraph, facts wrapped in politeness, irony veiled as cooperation. I attached a map of the property, highlighting the lot, the dock, and, yes, the lake itself. By the time they opened it, they would realize, slowly and painfully, who truly controlled the battlefield. As I hit send, I leaned back, letting the satisfaction of foresight settle in. The key wasn't chaos, it was anticipation. Each step, each small maneuver, was calculated, and the beauty of it was that they didn't even know they were being outmaneuvered. They were so convinced of their authority that reality had become irrelevant. In reality, in this case, was on my side. By late afternoon, I returned to the dock with a sense of accomplishment. I had planned subtle counters, strategic annoyances, and a communication that would make the HOA question their assumptions. I watched the sunlight shimmer on the water, imagining their reactions. A slight change in the parking lot, a polite email, and a sign leaning against the dock, I had effectively shifted the balance of power without lifting a finger in anger. This was the art of leverage, and it felt intoxicating. Then, as the sun began its slow descent, a thought occurred to me: patience was everything. The HOA thrived on deadlines, schedules, and the illusion of immediate consequences. I could manipulate that. I could make them chase shadows, worry over trifles, and slowly unravel their own sense of control. Every move would be a lesson in humility, every misstep a confirmation that they had underestimated me. I let out a soft laugh, leaning back against the railing. The lake was mine, the land was mine, and the parking lot, the unsuspecting linchpin of their comfort, was mine. The day ended with the kind of satisfaction that only comes from strategy executed flawlessly. Ducks settled in the reeds, the sun dipped low, and I watched as a gentle breeze rippled the water, reflecting golden light across the property I had long loved. Tomorrow, I knew, the HOA would return. They always did, but now, I wasn't merely reacting. I was preparing, I was plotting, I was in control, and the thought of turning the parking lot into a subtle, psychological battlefield made me grin. They had thought authority was theirs. They had thought intimidation worked. But as the last light faded over the lake, I knew something deliciously ironic was about to unfold. They were about to discover, the hard way, that the real power had nothing to do with rules or meetings or clipboards. It had to do with ownership, leverage, and the art of patience. And I, my friends, had it all. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and the subtle perfume of wildflowers growing along the edge of the farm lake. I stepped outside, stretching and yawning, letting the sun warm my face, but my mind was already in motion. Yesterday had been a revelation, a moment of clarity. The HOA had assumed authority, but in reality, they were fragile, dependent, and entirely predictable. Today, I would begin the first subtle moves of a campaign that promised not just victory but a lesson in humility for those who thought rules outweighed reality. I smiled at the thought. Power, I had discovered, was delicious when exercised with patience and a sense of humor. The first item on the agenda was the parking lot. That humble stretch of gravel had become the fulcrum of my strategy. The HOA relied on it as if it were an extension of their authority, unaware that access could be subtly denied. With a few well-placed orange cones and a gentle shift of the gate, I could create minor obstacles, enough to irritate, confuse, and unsettle them, but not enough to provoke outright confrontation. I moved deliberately, spacing the cones just so, imagining Marcy's horrified expression when she arrived. The slight inconvenience would gnaw at them slowly, a psychological nibble rather than a bite. Next, I turned my attention to the dock. Yesterday, I had leaned a small sign against the post, "Private dock, used by permission only." Today, I added a subtle touch, a whimsical handwritten note at the bottom that read, "Violators will be politely reminded of reality." It was playful, unassuming, yet the message was clear. Access came with conditions, and I was the one setting them. Every detail mattered. The positioning of the sign, the angle at which it caught the sunlight, the delicate humor in the phrasing. This was not chaos, this was chess. By mid-morning, the HOA arrived in their usual fashion, clipboards in hand, sunglasses shielding expressions they could not fully control. I waved lazily from the porch, coffee in hand, pretending to be lost in the rhythm of the water lapping against the dock. Marcy's eyes narrowed, and I could see the tension ripple through the group. They had come prepared for confrontation, and I had come prepared for strategy. It was a dance, a test of nerves and wits, and I was enjoying every step. "Good morning," Marcy began, her voice brittle but controlled, as if every syllable required immense effort. "We need to discuss your continued use of the lake property. There have been complaints," she paused dramatically, gesturing vaguely with the clipboard, "about compliance with HOA regulations." I smiled, tilting my head slightly. "Complaints? How curious. From whom? The ducks, the wind, or perhaps the fairies that sometimes visit at dawn?" My tone was light, teasing, but my eyes gleamed with the certainty of someone who knew exactly where the power lay. Marcy's lips pressed into that familiar thin line, the one I had come to recognize as the precursor to panic. Her assistant fidgeted behind her, clearly hoping I would take the bait and react with indignation. I didn't. Instead, I took a slow sip of my coffee and let the moment linger. "You know," I continued, "rules are wonderful things. They keep people in line, create order, and provide a sense of security. But only when they are applied logically, and only when the enforcer actually has the authority they claim. And as we've discussed, access to this dock, this lake, and the parking lot is, well, technically, entirely under my jurisdiction." I let the words sink in, watching the subtle shifts of discomfort ripple through the group. Marcy opened her mouth, perhaps to deliver a rehearsed threat, but I cut her off gently. "By the way," I added, nodding toward the parking lot, "you might notice a few minor adjustments. Nothing dramatic, just enough to keep things interesting. I call it practical logistics." The cones gleamed in the morning sun, perfectly positioned to introduce the tiniest of inconveniences. Her eyes flicked to them, then back at me, the thin veneer of authority cracking ever so slightly. The balding man ventured a protest. We need access for our inspections, meetings, and general operations," he said, voice quivering. I chuckled softly. "Of course," I said, walking down the dock as if to inspect the water. "And I'm more than happy to provide access. But it must be coordinated, scheduled, and, most importantly, acknowledge that I, as the landowner, retain discretion." I let my words trail, giving them room to squirm under the polite weight of legality and subtle control. Marcy's assistant, trying to salvage dignity, flipped through his clipboard as if the physical act of consulting the paper might magically restore their authority. "Section 14, Paragraph 7, Subsection B," he began, and I smiled, gently interrupting him. "Ah, yes, Subsection B. I remember reading it. Fascinating how words on a page sometimes forget the realities of property ownership. Charming oversight, really." The subtle mockery was deliberate, designed to irritate without aggression. I then moved to implement a slightly more creative maneuver. Taking the small rowboat, I repositioned it to partially block the dock's edge where the wall would typically step down for inspections. It wasn't a barrier, exactly, just a gentle inconvenience, a reminder that while they could attempt to assert power, every action had to be negotiated through me. Marcy noticed instantly, her eyebrows knitting together. She made a slight hand gesture to the assistant, who sighed, realizing the first real subtle challenge of the day had arrived. The group murmured among themselves, attempting to formulate a response that would not expose their reliance on the very infrastructure they sought to control. I leaned against the railing, coffee in hand, appearing utterly casual, watching the gears turn. Every shuffle of feet, every whispered conversation, every glance toward the strategically placed cones was a small victory. They were beginning to understand, in a subtle, creeping way, that this was not going to be a simple enforcement of rules. This was a lesson in leverage. Midday brought a small flurry of activity. I had arranged for a few neighborly visitors, friends who had no love for overbearing HOA antics, to wander near the parking lot, innocently occupying spaces and chatting in the sunshine. It was minor theater, subtle and playful, designed to introduce just enough disruption to unsettle the group. I could see Marcy's jaw tighten, the way she waved her arms slightly, trying to assert control over a situation that was entirely outside her influence. The beauty of it was in the restraint, chaos without malice. I decided to press the advantage further. Pulling out my phone, I sent a brief, polite reminder via email to the HOA board, just a friendly note that all access to the dock and parking lot should be coordinated. "Thank you for your understanding." Nothing aggressive, nothing threatening, yet the implication was undeniable. They relied on this access daily, and now every movement, every meeting, every inspection was subject to my subtle oversight. The realization would hit them gradually, painfully, and I allowed myself a quiet chuckle. By mid-afternoon, the tension had reached a delicious equilibrium. The HOA members were still on the property, their movements careful, their clipped voices tinged with frustration. I wandered along the dock, leaning against the posts, adjusting signs, and repositioning minor obstacles, all tiny gestures, almost invisible in their scale, yet monumental in their psychological impact. It was the art of leverage, control without confrontation, influence without overt aggression. They didn't realize they were being played, which made every small victory all the sweeter. Marcy finally attempted to assert herself with a formal announcement. "We expect cooperation," she said, voice firm, clipboard held high. Failure to comply could result in penalties or legal action. I smiled and tipped my head, allowing the gentle breeze to carry my voice. "Cooperation," I said softly, "is always easier when both parties understand the rules, and, in this case, the reality. I'm happy to cooperate. I simply ask that the same understanding applies to me." Her lips pressed into a line so thin it could barely be seen, and I knew the point had landed. The sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the lake, and I watched as the HOA gathered their papers and murmured among themselves. They had come ready to enforce authority, they left confronting reality. I leaned back against the railing, savoring the quiet satisfaction of a strategy executed flawlessly. Every cone, every sign, every polite reminder had shifted the balance of power without a single outburst. This was only the beginning, but it was a crucial first move, setting the stage for the conflicts to come. As I sipped the last of my coffee, I imagined tomorrow, new maneuvers, slightly more audacious, a further tightening of the leash. The HOA relied on routine, predictability, and the assumption that rules could override reality. I relied on patience, leverage, and a subtle hand guiding the narrative. And as the final rays of sunlight glinted off the water, I smiled, knowing the first counter move had been a resounding success. Yes, the lake was mine. The land was mine. The parking lot, the linchpin of their convenience, was mine. And now, the game was truly underway. By the time the sun had fully risen, casting a warm glow across the farm lake, I could already sense the ripple of tension that today would bring. Yesterday had been a lesson, a subtle demonstration of leverage, and the day before that had been a revelation of my ultimate advantage. But today, the HOA had returned in force, determined to escalate their authority, unaware that escalation was precisely the fuel I had been waiting for. I leaned on the dock railing, sipping my coffee, watching the approaching SUVs with the calm certainty of someone who knew the tide had already turned in their favor. They thought they were coming to assert control. In reality, they were walking straight into a carefully orchestrated trap of inconvenience, irony, and humor. Marcy led the charge, clipboard in hand, striding down the gravel path with the precision of a military drill, although her expression suggested she hadn't quite realized the war had already begun. Her assistant flanked her, muttering anxiously under his breath, while the rest of the team fanned out, eyes scanning every inch of the property as if ownership could somehow be claimed by staring hard enough. I waved lazily from the porch, letting the ducks waddle by in their usual indifference, the gentle quacking providing an almost comedic underscore to the unfolding drama. "Good morning," Marcy began, her voice unusually tight, betraying her inner frustration. "We have received additional complaints. Your continued use of the lake, the dock, and surrounding property is still not compliant with HOA guidelines. We must insist on immediate corrective action." She emphasized each word carefully, hoping to convey the weight of authority, though the sight of the cones, the repositioned rowboat, and the small signs told a different story, one in which her authority had no teeth. I smiled, tilting my head. "Immediate action," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. Interesting choice of phrasing. You do realize, of course, that immediate is somewhat flexible when it comes to property I own entirely, correct? My tone was light, teasing, but the subtext was unmistakable. The slight twitch in her jaw, the narrowing of her eyes, and the involuntary glance toward the carefully arranged obstacles in the parking lot confirmed my assessment. They were flustered, rattled, and beginning to grasp the imbalance of power. The balding man, desperate for some foothold, spoke up. "Technically, Section 14, Paragraph 7, Subsection B allows us to..." I raised a hand politely. "Ah yes, Subsection B. I read it last night. Fascinating how words on paper sometimes fail to account for actual property ownership. Quite the oversight." His face reddened, and he sank back a step, realizing that logic and legality were not the weapons he had imagined. Marcy's assistant tried to rescue the moment with a whisper of protest, but the tide of frustration was already rising, visible in the stiff posture and clenched fists around me. I decided it was time to escalate subtly. Not with confrontation, not with aggression, but with creativity. The parking lot had been slightly inconvenient yesterday. Today, I added a small layer of chaos. A few carefully chosen logs were placed near the entrance, arranged just enough to require slow, careful navigation. Nothing dangerous, nothing overtly malicious, just a gentle reminder that while access was allowed, control had shifted. I could see Marcy's eyes widen slightly as she approached the lot, mentally recalculating the maneuvering required. Her team flinched, realizing that the small gestures had consequences, and that they were no longer the arbiters of order. Then came the dock. Yesterday's sign had been a subtle assertion of control. Today, I added another, a playful but pointed note that read, "Authorized access only, violators will experience minor inconvenience." I leaned against the railing, sipping my coffee, enjoying the satisfaction of watching the HOA attempt to navigate rules that no longer applied in their favor. Every glance at the sign, every careful step around the rowboat, every pause to avoid an orange cone was a small victory in a war they hadn't realized they were losing. Mid-morning brought a small flurry of neighborly activity. Friends and acquaintances wandered the property, laughing, chatting, and using the parking lot and dock under the guise of innocent enjoyment. Their presence added another layer of controlled chaos, forcing the HOA members to negotiate every step, every access point, every interaction. Marcy's frown deepened, her clipboard shaking slightly in her hands as she muttered under her breath. It was a delicate dance, one I conducted with precision, allowing just enough interference to frustrate without provoking confrontation. By noon, the group was visibly unraveling. Voices were raised in clipped tones, gestures became exaggerated, and the careful illusion of control crumbled under the pressure of subtle but relentless inconvenience. "We require full access immediately," Marcy demanded, though her voice lacked the certainty she had tried to project. I leaned casually on the railing, letting the water ripple under my fingertips, and replied, "Full access, of course. Let's coordinate a schedule, shall we? That way, everyone enjoys clarity and avoids confusion. I find that mutually beneficial arrangements are far more productive than arbitrary demands." The phrase was carefully neutral, but the subtext was unmistakable. I was setting the terms. The balding man attempted to assert himself again. "We need to enforce guidelines," he barked, voice cracking slightly. I laughed softly, the sound drifting across the lake like wind through reeds. "Enforce guidelines," I echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Interesting. You see, enforcement presupposes authority. Authority presupposes control, and control, in this case, belongs to the owner of the lake, dock, and parking lot. But I do appreciate your enthusiasm." The gentle sarcasm was almost invisible, like a whisper, yet it struck at the heart of their frustration. As the afternoon progressed, the situation escalated further, not with direct conflict, but with a series of carefully engineered inconveniences. A small gate was subtly repositioned, forcing the HOA vehicles to backtrack slightly. Chairs were moved in the picnic area where they intended to gather, creating minor logistical challenges. A gentle, unexpected splash of water from the dock, just enough to dampen shoes without causing harm, added a final touch of subtle mischief. Each action was designed to erode confidence, creating chaos without confrontation, and I relished every moment. Marcy, realizing her team's frustration, attempted a final show of authority. "We will document this behavior and escalate to the board," she said sharply, her hands trembling slightly. I smiled, nodding as if she had delivered sage advice. "Please do," I replied calmly. "Documentation is always valuable, and the board will surely appreciate clarity regarding property boundaries and access rights. I'm certain everyone will benefit from a mutual understanding of reality." The phrase was polite, neutral, almost overly courteous, but the implication was deliciously sharp. By late afternoon, the HOA's frustration had reached a boiling point. They had tried rules, threats, and meetings, yet every effort was countered with subtle, well-planned maneuvers that left them flustered and ineffective. I leaned back against the railing, sipping my coffee as the sun cast golden hues across the water, feeling a deep satisfaction. This was not mere mischief, this was strategy executed with precision. They were learning, slowly and painfully, that control could not be asserted where ownership and leverage already existed. Finally, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, I surveyed the aftermath. The cones, the repositioned rowboat, the gentle obstructions in the parking lot, all small victories, invisible in their scale but monumental in effect. Marcy's team was exhausted, flustered, and utterly aware, now, that yesterday's arrogance had met today's subtle genius. And I, for my part, remained calm, collected, and amused, knowing that tomorrow would bring further opportunities for strategic disruption, each more intricate than the last. The day ended with a quiet triumph. Ducks settled in the reeds, the wind whispered through the trees, and I allowed myself a slow, satisfied smile. Chaos had been introduced not through aggression, but through subtle manipulation, patience, and leverage. The HOA had escalated, and in doing so, had revealed the true nature of their reliance and their fragility. Power, I thought, was as much about patience and strategy as it was about action. And I had it in abundance. Yes, the lake was mine. The land was mine. The parking lot, the critical linchpin of their convenience, was mine. And as the last light of day shimmered across the water, I knew that the game had only just begun. The next moves would be bolder, the stakes higher, and the lessons harsher. But for now, I allowed myself the quiet satisfaction of victory. Subtle, strategic, inevitable victory. The morning dawned crisp and bright over the farm lake, the sunlight sparkling off the water in sharp, almost blinding glints. Normally, this would have been the kind of peaceful morning that made life feel infinite and calm, but today, the lake seemed to vibrate with anticipation. I could feel it in the slight rustle of the leaves, the quiet hum of insects along the edge of the dock, even in the distant quack of the ducks. Today was the day the HOA would realize, fully, that they were playing a game where the rules didn't favor them, and I intended to make it unforgettable. By mid-morning, the black SUVs rolled up the gravel path, engines purring like overconfident lions. Marcy was in the lead, clipboard in hand, her stride precise but tense, every inch the image of someone determined to assert authority, but entirely unaware that the tides of control had already shifted. Her assistant followed closely, muttering under his breath, while the rest of the group fanned out behind them, eyes darting to cones, signs, and slight obstacles they had not anticipated. I waved casually from the porch, as if I were merely a spectator enjoying the morning sun. "Good morning," Marcy said, voice tight, clipboard raised like a shield. "We are here to address repeated violations and ensure compliance. Your continued use of the lake and dock." She paused, scanning the carefully placed obstacles. The rowboat slightly shifted, the cones perfectly aligned, must be corrected immediately. Her voice carried authority she did not possess, and the tension in her jaw betrayed her panic. I set down my coffee and smiled, tilting my head. "Corrected immediately," I repeated, letting the words float over the lake like a gentle challenge. Interesting phrasing. As you know, access here is subject to my oversight. I'm more than happy to cooperate with a schedule. Would you like me to draft one? My tone was cheerful, deceptively casual, but the underlying message was clear. The power now rested with me, and every step they took would be guided by my terms. The balding man fumbled with his clipboard, trying to assert some semblance of procedural authority. We can't allow obstructions. We have legal authority." I laughed softly, letting the sound drift over the water. "Legal authority? How quaint. Do you mind showing me the clause that grants legal authority over property I own outright?" "Because I must have missed it." His face flushed, and Marcy's fingers clenched the clipboard, white-knuckled, as the reality began to sink in. They had imagined control, but control without leverage is nothing more than a fantasy. I decided it was time to escalate the subtlety into a strategic masterstroke. Moving toward the parking lot, I adjusted a few of the cones and logs, creating a slight but deliberate zigzag path that forced the SUVs to navigate carefully. Not dangerously, just enough to introduce mild inconvenience and psychological tension. Marcy's eyes widened as she calculated the angles, the assistant sighed audibly, and the rest of the team muttered under their breath. Every step they took was now dictated by my invisible hand, a dance choreographed by patience and leverage. Next came the dock. I had added a second sign overnight, perfectly aligned to catch the morning light. Unauthorized access will result in mildly annoying delays. I leaned against the railing, sipping my coffee, watching as Marcy approached. She stopped abruptly, reading the sign, her expression twisting through disbelief, frustration, and something resembling panic. "Delays," she muttered. "That's ridiculous." I smiled sweetly. "Delays are sometimes necessary when navigating reality rather than imagined authority," I said. The humor was light, the jab surgical, and the effect immediate. She froze, caught between the absurdity of the phrasing and the impossibility of acting without my cooperation. The assistant attempted to salvage the moment with a quotation from the rulebook. According to Section 14, Paragraph 7, I held up my hand, silencing him without malice. Yes, I read subsection B. Fascinating how words sometimes fail to account for the world they intend to control. I let the words sink in, watching as frustration slowly replaced confidence on their faces. They were trying to enforce rules, but the leverage had shifted. My ownership, my subtle manipulations, my careful patience, it all now dictated the pace and terms of engagement. By noon, the chaos reached a mild but noticeable crescendo. I had positioned a few neighbors strategically, occupying spaces and innocently wondering where the HOA intended to gather. The ducks quacked indignantly, as if voicing the lake's own judgment. The wind rustled in the trees, carrying laughter and chatter across the water. Every movement of the HOA team required coordination, thought, and caution, none of which they had anticipated needing. Marcy's brow furrowed deeper with every step, her voice rising fractionally as she attempted to issue commands that could not be followed without my consent. I decided it was time for a psychological flourish. Walking along the dock, I gently nudged the rowboat to partially block the edge where they would normally step down. Not enough to prevent access, merely enough to require care and attention. Marcy's eyes widened in disbelief. "This is absurd," she said, her voice tight. "We need to access the dock fully." I nodded politely. "Of course, full access is always possible, provided coordination with the property owner occurs. I'm sure we can arrange something mutually beneficial." Her hands trembled slightly, and the assistant looked on, helpless, as the reality of their situation sank in. The HOA's frustration became almost palpable. Meetings, rules, and threats were useless against subtle leverage and patient strategy. The parking lot zigzag, the signs, the carefully placed neighbors, the gentle obstruction at the dock, each element contributed to a sense of controlled chaos that left them flustered and ineffective. They had imagined authority. In reality, they were participants in a game where the rules had been rewritten overnight, and the board was nowhere to be seen. By late afternoon, the tipping point arrived. Marcy, finally realizing that conventional tactics were failing, attempted a direct confrontation. "We will report this behavior to the board," she announced sharply, clipboard raised like a sword. I smiled warmly, taking a casual step forward. "Please do," I said, voice soft but deliberate. "Documentation is always valuable, and I'm sure the board will appreciate clarity regarding property ownership, access coordination, and logistical nuances. I'm confident they will see the situation exactly as it is." Her lips pressed into a line thinner than paper, the kind of expression that signaled both fury and resignation. The remainder of the team exchanged nervous glances, realizing that escalation had failed. Threats had no teeth, rules had no bite, and the practical leverage, the dock, the lake, the parking lot, was entirely under my control. Their frustration was a tangible thing, visible in stiff postures, clenched fists, and muttered exclamations. Yet I remained calm, sipping coffee and enjoying the spectacle. The subtle psychological warfare, the patient orchestration of inconvenience and irony, had transformed what they imagined as conflict into a masterclass in leverage and control. As the sun began to dip low, painting the lake in molten gold, I surveyed the aftermath. Cones still in place, signs perfectly positioned, rowboats slightly shifted, neighbors lingering innocently, every element of my strategy intact. Marcy and her team retreated, muttering and strategizing for their next move, unaware that each action taken on future visits would continue to be dictated by my subtle but absolute leverage. Ducks quacked approvingly, or so I imagined, and the breeze carried the sound across the water as if marking the victory. I leaned back on the railing, savoring the satisfaction of a perfectly executed plan. This was not mere luck or happenstance, it was patience, strategy, and understanding of power dynamics at their finest. I had allowed them to believe in their authority, only to demonstrate gradually that real control depended not on rules, but on leverage, ownership, and careful planning. The lesson had been delivered with humor, subtlety, and precision. Yes, the lake was mine. The dock was mine. The parking lot, the crucial linchpin of the HOA's daily convenience, was mine. And as the last rays of sunlight shimmered across the water, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: the showdown was complete, the first battle won, and the true war for control had only just begun. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but I had set the tone. Subtlety, strategy, and leverage would always prevail over arrogance and imagined authority. The morning air over the farm lake was calm, almost deceivingly serene, as if nature itself had paused to watch the unfolding drama. I stood on the porch, coffee in hand, letting the warmth seep into my fingers while my mind churned with anticipation. Yesterday's showdown had been a triumph of patience, leverage, and subtle chaos, leaving the HOA flustered and frustrated. But I knew their next move was inevitable. When bureaucrats are pushed to the edge, they escalate, and escalation was precisely what I had been preparing for. I sipped my coffee and smiled. The fun was far from over. By mid-morning, the familiar convoy of SUVs rolled up the gravel path. Marcy led the charge, eyes narrowed, lips pressed into that uncompromising line of authority, and yet her posture betrayed a mix of anxiety and determination. The assistant fidgeted beside her, clutching his clipboard as if it could shield him from the reality of the lake, the dock, and the parking lot, all mine. The rest of the team fanned out behind them, whispering, glancing at the cones and signs I had meticulously placed over the past days. They were aware now, subtly but unmistakably, that they were not in control. And today, I knew, they intended to do something rash. Marcy approached the dock first, clipboard in hand, voice sharp and deliberate. "We have received repeated complaints from residents regarding your continued noncompliance. This behavior will not be tolerated. We insist on immediate correction of all violations." I smiled politely, setting down my coffee. "Immediate correction," I repeated, letting the words linger in the air. An interesting term. As you know, coordination and consent are essential when it comes to property I own outright. "Shall we schedule a mutually agreeable plan?" Her jaw tightened, the attempt to assert dominance faltering in the face of my calm and collected tone. The assistant tried to interject, flipping frantically through his rulebook. "According to Section 14, Paragraph 7, I raised a hand, silencing him gently. Yes, subsection B. I read it last night. Truly fascinating. Though, as I'm sure you understand, rules on paper don't always translate neatly to reality." The words were delivered lightly, but the sting was clear. The HOA's reliance on procedure had become a vulnerability, and I intended to exploit it fully. By late morning, it became evident that Marcy had orchestrated a new tactic. The board had apparently sent instructions for a surprise inspection, complete with additional staff, forms, and threats of fines. Their plan was audacious, bold, and, predictably, misguided. They believed that sheer numbers, a flurry of paperwork, and intimidation could overcome the subtle leverage I had established. I leaned casually against the dock railing, watching them arrive, feeling the familiar thrill of anticipation. Let them come. The stage was set. I decided to introduce my first countermeasure. With a casual stroll, I adjusted the parking lot obstacles I had created earlier, ensuring that the SUVs would have to navigate carefully, zigzagging through cones and logs. Nothing overtly aggressive, nothing dangerous, just enough to slow them down and introduce mild tension. I could see Marcy's eyes widen as she calculated the best route, while the assistant muttered under his breath, clearly recognizing that their meticulously planned inspection was already compromised. Subtle chaos, introduced with surgical precision, was beginning to work its magic. Next, I turned to the dock. I had added a new sign overnight, hand-lettered and polite: "Access requires coordination with property owner. Violators may experience minor inconveniences." I smiled, leaning against the post as Marcy's gaze fell upon it. She froze, a brief flicker of disbelief crossing her features. "Minor inconveniences," she muttered, clearly flustered. "This is ridiculous." I tilted my head and replied softly, "Sometimes minor inconveniences are necessary to navigate reality rather than imagination." Her jaw clenched, her clipboard trembling slightly in her hands. The board's surprise inspection continued, and I began implementing additional subtle strategies. I had enlisted a few neighbors to wander near the dock and parking lot, chatting innocently, using spaces, and creating minor, carefully managed congestion. Every step required negotiation, coordination, and patience on the HOA's part, qualities they clearly lacked. The tension built like a slow crescendo, each small inconvenience amplifying their frustration without a single overt confrontation. By early afternoon, the HOA's desperation became palpable. Marcy attempted a formal announcement: "We will document every violation and escalate to the board immediately." I nodded politely, smiling as if she had delivered sage advice. "Please do," I said. "Documentation is always valuable, and I'm confident the board will appreciate clarity regarding property boundaries, access coordination, and procedural details. I'm sure everyone will benefit from a mutual understanding of reality." Her lips pressed into a thin line, the effort to maintain composure clearly failing. The assistant, realizing that conventional tactics were futile, tried to negotiate directly. "Perhaps we can work together." he ventured, voice wavering. I smiled, appreciating the attempt. Of course, I replied. Cooperation is always preferable when both parties recognize the realities of ownership and leverage. Let's create a plan that satisfies everyone, shall we? His shoulders slumped, the subtle acknowledgement that the balance of power had shifted becoming impossible to ignore. The rest of the HOA, meanwhile, was unraveling. Nervous glances, whispered instructions, and exaggerated gestures betrayed the internal panic. They had come prepared to enforce rules, but rules alone could not overcome ownership, subtle manipulation, and strategic patience. The cones, signs, and carefully placed neighbors were not mere obstacles, they were instruments of psychological pressure, designed to erode confidence and expose overconfidence. The results were visible, almost tangible, and immensely satisfying. By mid-afternoon, I decided to escalate subtly yet dramatically. I gently repositioned the rowboat at the dock's edge, partially obstructing access. It wasn't a barricade, merely a minor inconvenience, but it forced careful navigation and introduced a sense of vulnerability. Marcy's eyes widened, a mixture of disbelief and irritation crossing her features. "This is absurd," she muttered. "We need full access." I nodded politely. Of course, full access is always possible, provided coordination with the property owner occurs. That seems reasonable, doesn't it? The implication was clear. Every step they took now required negotiation through me. Tension built further when a minor logistical hiccup appeared. One of the SUVs, carefully maneuvering through the parking lot, had to stop abruptly to avoid a cone. The balding man muttered an expletive under his breath, earning a sharp look from Marcy. I could see their irritation mounting with each passing minute, each small disruption calculated to frustrate without crossing legal or ethical boundaries. It was a delicate balance, but one I had mastered. By late afternoon, the HOA team had reached the limits of their patience. Marcy's voice grew sharper, the assistant muttered frantic instructions, and the rest of the group whispered urgently, attempting to salvage some sense of control. Every maneuver, every attempt at authority, was subtly countered with patience, strategic inconvenience, and gentle humor. I leaned on the railing, savoring the spectacle, recognizing the culmination of several days' careful planning. The HOA was floundering, and every misstep only confirmed the shift of power. Finally, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the lake, I surveyed the aftermath. Cones remained in place, signs perfectly positioned, rowboat partially obstructing the dock, neighbors lingering innocently. The HOA had attempted escalation, only to discover that conventional tactics were powerless against subtle leverage, careful planning, and absolute ownership. Ducks quacked in apparent approval, the wind whispered through the trees, and the lake shimmered in the golden light, a perfect backdrop for the lesson delivered. I leaned back, sipping the last of my coffee, relishing the satisfaction of strategy executed flawlessly. The HOA had escalated, attempted intimidation, and tried to assert authority, yet each effort had been countered with subtlety, patience, and precise manipulation. The balance of power had shifted irrevocably, and the lesson was clear: ownership, leverage, and foresight triumph over rules, threats, and arrogance. As darkness began to settle over the farm lake, I allowed myself a slow, satisfied smile. The HOA had struck back, but their strikes had only reinforced their vulnerability. Tomorrow, new tactics might be attempted, new threats might arise, but I had proven, beyond doubt, that the lake, dock, and parking lot, the linchpins of their imagined authority, were mine. And the war for control, though far from over, was increasingly tilted in my favor. Yes, the showdown was complete. The HOA had escalated, chaos had been introduced, and yet, every step, every miscalculation, every flustered expression had served to confirm a simple truth: the real power had always been mine. The morning sun stretched over the farm lake in a lazy golden haze, illuminating the water like molten glass and casting long, playful shadows across the dock. For the first time in days, the lake felt completely tranquil, not the deceptive calm of anticipation, but the quiet, absolute serenity of inevitability. I stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand, breathing deeply, feeling a rare mixture of satisfaction and amusement. After a week of subtle maneuvers, carefully orchestrated chaos, and relentless leverage, the HOA's campaign of intimidation had run its course. Today, the final act would unfold, and the lesson would be unmistakable. The lake, the dock, and the parking lot were mine, and the rules of reality outweighed the delusions of bureaucracy. The familiar convoy of SUVs approached mid-morning, but there was a noticeable change in demeanor. Marcy led as always, clipboard in hand, but her stride lacked the confident precision of previous days. Her assistant flanked her, muttering quietly, and the rest of the team shuffled behind like a flock of birds trying to maintain order in a sudden windstorm. The subtle chaos I had orchestrated over the past week had left its mark. Cones, signs, slight obstructions, and gentle diversions had all contributed to a psychological tightening that now showed on every face. Today, I would seal the lesson with a flourish that was both effective and utterly, satisfyingly humorous. Marcy's attempt at authority was cautious, even tentative. We require access to the dock and the parking lot for inspections and board meetings," she said, voice clipped but softer than before. I leaned casually on the railing, smiling broadly, as if I were merely enjoying the morning and the scenery. "Access," I repeated gently, letting the word hang in the air. "Of course, access is always possible, with coordination. Perhaps we can formalize a schedule, so everyone enjoys clarity and avoids confusion." The suggestion was innocuous on the surface, polite and neutral, yet it carried the undeniable truth: every step they took was now subject to my terms. The assistant attempted a feeble defense. "We have guidelines, regulations, procedures." I tilted my head, suppressing a chuckle. Guidelines, regulations, procedures, fascinating. Truly, I'm sure they work beautifully on paper. But in practice, on property that I own outright, we must consider practicalities. Shall we? His face fell, realizing that words alone no longer held power, while Marcy's lips pressed into that familiar thin line of exasperation. By mid-morning, I began the final maneuvers that would turn subtle leverage into absolute closure. First, the parking lot. I had left it open but arranged the cones and logs in a way that allowed access only along a single carefully plotted path, ensuring both safety and a symbolic demonstration of control. Each vehicle had to navigate deliberately, slowly, with attention to detail, an almost ceremonial acknowledgement that the space was mine to regulate. I could see Marcy flinch at every careful turn, her sense of command evaporating under the weight of inevitability. Next came the dock. I had added one last touch, a small, elegant sign at the edge of the water, hand-lettered and polite: "Authorized access only. Enjoy at your convenience with coordination." It was charming, subtle, and perfectly clear. They could proceed, but on my terms. I watched as Marcy approached, her eyes scanning the sign, reading and rereading the wording, every syllable driving home the lesson of leverage and patience. "Convenience," she muttered, half incredulous, half exasperated. "Yes," I said, smiling warmly. "Convenience for those who respect the realities of ownership." The final jab, delivered gently, seemed to deflate her completely. The board had attempted one last desperate escalation, a formal warning notice, delivered via email and printed copies, threatening fines and penalties. I had anticipated this, of course. With a casual glance, I drafted a polite, professional response, attaching the property deed, a map of the land, and a concise reminder that the lake, dock, and parking lot were private property. The email was courteous, humorous in tone, and utterly decisive. Within moments, the board's threats had no weight. Every legal maneuver they imagined had already been countered by fact, leverage, and clarity. By noon, the HOA team's frustration had reached peak levels. They whispered, gestured, and muttered, realizing that every attempt to assert authority had been met with patient, precise counteraction. I decided it was time to introduce a final, symbolic flourish. With a few friendly neighbors, I staged a casual gathering on the dock and in the parking lot, fishing, chatting, and moving vehicles in and out for fun. The HOA members watched, flustered, realizing that the spaces they sought to control were being used freely, responsibly, and entirely on my terms. Their authority was nominal, my leverage, absolute. Marcy attempted one final show of power, pointing to the cones and signs. This is unacceptable. You're obstructing access." I laughed lightly, tilting my head. "Obstructing," I echoed. "Not at all. We're simply managing access responsibly. Consider it organized enjoyment." The subtle humor, the calm confidence, and the unshakable control were irresistible. Marcy's jaw tightened, her assistant sighed, and the rest of the team exchanged anxious glances. It was the final act of the week-long lesson. Rules and threats were meaningless when met with ownership, strategy, and patience. By mid-afternoon, the HOA had finally retreated. Marcy's posture was stiff, her lips pressed into a thin line, the assistant trailing behind muttering about next steps that would lead nowhere. The rest of the team shuffled away, defeated, frustrated, and, I suspected, a little humiliated. The lake, The dock and the parking lot had been reclaimed, not through confrontation, but through subtle, clever orchestration that had left them with only a polite understanding of reality. I leaned back against the railing, savoring the satisfaction of patience rewarded. As the sun began to dip low over the water, casting a warm golden glow across the lake, I walked along the dock, running my fingers through the gentle ripples. The ducks quacked lazily, the breeze rustled through the trees, and the water shimmered like molten glass. The week of tension, strategy, and subtle warfare had come to an end. I had not only defended my property, but I had also asserted control in the most elegant, satisfying way possible. The HOA had learned their lesson. Leverage, patience, and ownership always triumph over arrogance, rules, and imagined authority. I decided to commemorate the victory with one final, playful gesture. I placed a small, whimsical sign at the dock's edge: "Welcome to the lake, enjoy responsibly." It was polite, humorous, and entirely mine. Anyone who read it would understand the tone. The lake was a sanctuary, a space of calm and enjoyment, and entry required respect for reality. It was the perfect closure to the week-long saga, a combination of humor, authority, and subtle mastery. By sunset, the lake had returned to its peaceful state. The HOA would no longer dare to test the limits of ownership. The dock, the parking lot, and the lake itself were secure. I leaned back on the porch, coffee long finished, smiling to myself. The week had been exhausting, exhilarating, and utterly satisfying. Every strategy had worked, every subtle maneuver had paid off, and the lesson had been delivered with precision, humor, and patience. Yes, the victory was complete. The HOA had attempted escalation, confrontation, and intimidation. They had struck back with rules, threats, and formalities. And yet, every move they made only highlighted the reality they had ignored. True control lies in ownership, leverage, and subtle, strategic execution. The lake was mine. The dock was mine. The parking lot was mine. And with a final glance at the water sparkling in the golden sunset, I knew the saga had ended exactly as it should. The ducks quacked their approval, or perhaps it was just coincidence, but I like to think they were acknowledging the triumph. The breeze whispered through the trees, carrying the sense of closure across the property. And as night fell over the farm lake, I felt a rare, complete satisfaction. The HOA had been outmaneuvered, every threat neutralized, and the lesson firmly impressed. Ownership, patience, humor, and leverage had prevailed. And the lake, shimmering under the moonlight, was a reminder of that truth: perfect, calm, and utterly mine.